Great.
So over to you, Emmett.
Yeah, so I'll kick off. There's a PowerPoint that we can, of course, share with everyone that we'll work through before that I'll start and hand over to Amar to finish before we move to the roundtable discussion amongst everyone. And you can see some of the questions already put up there. We had put 30 minutes for each, but I think we get through a lot of the content quickly if I stop talking about it and get to it. Then yeah, have more time for discussion. So I think we can go to the next slide. So this is initiative 4.2. I see some of the members are here. I'm not going to read the slides. There's a lot of content here. It's also meant to be, this was part of one of their outputs. So this was meant to be standalone and read. But of course, the rationale for 4.2 was quite obvious, following on the meeting here that led to the roadmap, the need for more coordinated action and collaboration on increasing humanitarian financing, humanitarian WASH financing. But the main idea that we were grappling with was a potential humanitarian pooled fund financing facility, funding facility that could feed into these last 4 points down at the bottom, actual emergency responses, overall building of resilience, and coordination. So this was the overall rationale. We'll go to the next slide. And what was discussed in 2020 as the participants of the initiative came together and worked through it. The first was to map the existing global funds, the ones that are up and running, the ones that haven't taken off, to learn as much as we could to help inform a decision around such a humanitarian WASH fund. And the second objective, to really understand the parameters to help us make a decision on whether or not we go forward with such a fund. So this is what Global Health Vision has done. Next slide, please. And here's a bit on their methodology. I think some of you might have been consulted as they did their key informant interviews. I leave it up here. There was quite a bit of work done here in the desk review and the in-depth interviews with quite a few donors as well. Next slide, please. Won't linger on this. And here's the list of financing facilities that were researched. And yeah, also this had to do with the key informants came from these funds as well. Next slide, please. So now we start to get to the value proposition, and there's a lot of text here. You can see these are the benefits on the left for general pooled funding for humanitarian responses. I think people are quite familiar with those. And then on the right, where we saw the value add for the humanitarian WASH pool fund itself. Again, I kind of let you skim those on the right. But I think you get towards the bottom, and this was also something that I think had built into a consensus within the 4.2 members, is that the big advantage would have been on preparedness, potentially on resilience, depending on how you define it, not necessarily on the acute response, although that would have been a part of it. Yeah, and I think another one was on the bridging the nexus. So the next two slides are on the challenges. This is on the humanitarian WASH fund specifically. Again, you see some of the key points here. Protracted crisis could dominate and kind of drain the fund. The donors raised quite a few questions and concerns, considering their longstanding contributions were already kind of covered. I think maybe to summarize, at least from the donor side, there wasn't, even if Global Health Vision was going to them kind of with blue sky thinking and asking for them to be, let's say, generous and think about the potential benefits, there were a lot more objections than there were kind of votes of confidence and or reasons to go forward. I think naturally the loss of control, a little bit of the redundancy or adding another layer of bureaucracy was flagged. So, there were quite a few challenges and concerns that were raised. Go to the next slide, please. And finally, the key takeaways, and after this, I'll hand over to Omar. So amongst donors, practitioners, there was pretty low appetite for such a fund, and in some cases, quite strong concerns raised to not further fragment this the space, too many funds, undermining some of the work done at country level, distrust, anticipatory funds. I liked that one. And yeah, the fact that there's many donors felt they were already stretched. I don't think I saw that here, but we're quite stretched and didn't see that there would be an opportunity to generate more funds. So maybe this is where I hand over to Omar. Omar?
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmett. I'll quickly scan through the key parameters for establishing a WASH humanitarian fund. Of course, there's the mission, the mandate. There's a need to have clear distinction from existing humanitarian WASH funds. There are so many out there. Founding partners, there's likely a need for institutional partners to nest this fund within, such as IFIs, UN agencies, foundations, and so forth. Potentially, it should not be a standalone such as Gavi, rather hosted by one of the constituencies that I just mentioned under the founding partners. The governance, it's not going to be, an easy one. There has to be clear delineation for accountabilities, for fundraising, coordination, approving programs and disbursement, strategy and policy development, monitoring and evaluation, legal and financial management, and so forth. And most of these funds do have board of directors, and some are in one way or the other members driven. Operations, often a secretariat or staff manage the day-to-day operations, and this can, of course, pose some, challenges in terms of complexity and increasing the transaction costs. Donors, most of these existing funds are heavily intergovernmental funded. Other donors typically include INGOs, the private sector foundations, and so forth. There will have, of course, to be a technical mechanism for review, clearance, vetting, and so forth. It can require many technical areas of expertise for WASH humanitarian, such as climate, epidemiology, protection, and so forth. The type of funding window, meaning is it for rapid onset of an emergency, underfunded emergencies, multi-year anticipatory funding, and so forth. Next, please. Continuing the parameters, allocations, the types, is it grants, loans, matching funds, national hubs, and the principles of equity and transparency are going to be critical. And it's recommended to look at allocation should be transparent and purely performance-based. Reporting protocols, they're very complex, as all of us are aware, especially with numerous donors. Some funds, existing funds like Education Cannot Wait, do have a standardized, uniform, fund-specific approach for reporting, while others do have dedicated teams for engagement and reporting with donors. Fiduciary principles, considerations range from accounting to environmental and social impacts. The business model, persuading sovereign donors to invest in the fund, balanced risk portfolio, and so forth. Eligibility model. Is it the country eligibility model? Is it fragility considerations? Is it the gross national product, World Bank Fragility Index, OECD, and so forth? The disbursement mechanism, how can these be forecasted, stockpiled, activated quickly, scope of support, be that supplies or whatever shape or form that can take. Next, please. last yet not least, as related to the recommendations and the conclusions, based on the key informant interviews, GHV recommends concluding exploring establishment of a WASH humanitarian fund. It also recommends exploring other opportunities to broaden and diversify funding and to support research agendas that might appeal to the donors. Some of the considerations that they have tabled include private sector matching for bilaterals, linking with other sectors such as, specifically climate change. We know that this is now the buzzword, and that's what it's attracting a lot of attention. Finally, seek investors with interest in social impact. I'll leave it there, and thank you so very much for your attention, and back to you, Jamal.
Thanks, Emmett and Omar. We finished in 14 minutes, so we have more time for discussion. I think we can open up for questions or comments, inputs. Anyone would like to go? Yes, John?
Yeah, I'm happy to start here. Emmett, regarding your presentation, I'm just remembering when we set the roadmap a long time ago. It was on the assumption that the funding for humanitarian WASH were decreasing globally and that the needs were increasing. And I guess it's still the case. So on this, I think that the reluctance of the donors is not so much about putting more money on the WASH, humanitarian WASH, but on the model on how we put this money. Today, the donors are extremely around localization. And so I think, to ask for a new global fund may be a little, like a blockage for donors, but presenting a humanitarian fund that would be dealt through localization, even if it's more complex, but here the humanitarian community could support on that, may be more attractive for them. I have the impression that, according to your presentation, Emmett, they were saying another humanitarian fund, another global humanitarian fund, where there are a lot of them. But in the same time, no one really knows how to implement localization. And what is fundamental is to keep in mind that we still need we still need money for humanitarian WASH. So the need is still there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Maybe we can take one more question. Guillaume?
Thank you. And indeed, it's a bit in the same vein as what Jean said. I'm surprised to hear that donors eventually don't see an issue in humanitarian WASH financing, because that's what it is about. And I think all figures show that there is not enough money for humanitarian WASH, and so it's really surprising to me to see that that result. And I think what you said, Ahmed, at the beginning is quite good, and I think that's how, at least how I would see the potential interest of fund is to cover more interventions related to resilience building, to preparedness, where eventually we are using quite a lot of humanitarian funds, current humanitarian funds, which could then be allocated to purely humanitarian emergency response. And so it would be more a diversification of funding to make sure that these humanitarian WASH funds, which exist now, are used purely for emergency response. And that may be a bit a way to reduce the gap that we are all facing. So maybe more a comment than a question, but that's it on my side.
Thanks, Guillaume. Maybe we can, Emmett, do you have any, or Omar, you have any response? Omar?
Quickly, just because John had directed at me, although I think even Jean's was more of a comment than a question, but yeah, I agree. And I guess it's, we're not going to solve the puzzle. I mean, as we've discussed, Guillaume, you've been in the 4.2 meetings, and we all agree we're not we're not looking to take a larger share of the pie from other sectors, right? And I think we all recognize, as Jean alludes to, that yeah, record number of displaced against stagnant or diminishing humanitarian budgets is a challenge no matter what. I don't know if it's that we showed up 5 years too late with the concept, or we haven't demonstrated that value add. And yeah, maybe that's part of it. I mean, I think it's worth exploring that idea, Jean, about that localization, although then I guess the immediate counter argument is, why do you need a global fund to work on localization? Wouldn't you leave it to the colleagues in specific regions or countries who could be more dynamic and dig in more? I don't know. I think it's all interesting points to kind of unpack. But I see Omar has his hand up as well, so maybe I hand over to Omar for his reaction.
Omar?
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmett, and thank you, Jamal. And thanks, John and Guillaume. Yes, localization, that's a new idea. And that exactly was one of the comments that came from one of the IFIs, without mentioning any names, that this may jeopardize local efforts. So, you know, this global fund can jeopardize local efforts, which speaks to your comment, to the one of the beginning, one of your comments, Jean, that they were considering localization. Nonetheless, the rest of the remarks made by the donors include this very IFI, is they have little appetite to channel their funding through new mechanisms, which implicitly implies there is no appetite to increase the funding. We take note of your comment, John and Guillaume, and of course, we are all bit by these bitter and sour facts. The space is shrinking, the funding space is shrinking big time, and we all need more funding. However, a new fund may not necessarily, based on the consultation and the interviews conducted by GHV, result in additional funding. The way they explained it to GHV was, it's a fixed pool of funding, and it's going to be distributed against, you know, among existing funds. So there is no need to create something new. And the idea that we had discussed earlier, all of us together with the Secretariat, Marc-Andre, Claudio, and other colleagues, is we need additional funding. We don't need the existing pool, and we don't need to compete against other sectors, because we recognize the needs across the board. And we thought that the magic bullet would sit with the IFIs. However, yeah, these interviews with IFIs were quite shocking to us, or it did not bear the fruit we expected. Over.
Thanks, Omar. Francois?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, just maybe to bounce on this private sector bilateral suggestion at the end of the presentation here, private sector matching for bilaterals. Just to mention that it seems to be that the private sector, so I'm particularly connected to the construction sector, but engineering and architecture space is willing at the international level, so we're not talking about localization here, but international firms are quite keen to put some pro bono efforts and help and staff to support some of the project. And it is considered to some extent as, it could be considered, well, it is considered by the NGOs benefiting from this as funding, as additional funding to a project. So my point is, there might be a way here to explore how much private sector help or input or pro bono help, it could be channeled to the WASH sector. So I'm not sure it will be considered as more funding, but there is something to explore there. And this might be a connection with Initiative 3.2, which is looking at this as well. So just mentioning there might be a bridge there to build on to address this particular private sector matching for bilaterals item which is on the slide of the recommendation. Over.
Thanks, Francois. Any comment from Ahmed, Omar? Francois, is there a new hand or is it the old hand?
Sorry?
Is your, I mean, your hand is still raised, so is it a new hand or is it the old
Oh,
one?
no, sorry. It's the
Okay.
old hand.
Okay. Oh, Omar.
Yeah, I just wanted to share something, and it doesn't necessarily, respond to Francois' comment. In UNICEF, we are exploring establishment, and we've actually progressed quite well on this establishment of a lending facility for fragile settings in the WASH sector. I mean, we have the models and everything, but again, there is limited appetite. And then lending in a way defeats the purpose because it's meant for nexus, for implementing longer term undertakings and so forth. So it's not really flexible. It's limited to a certain scope. It doesn't necessarily address all of the angles and the areas that we had envisaged for this fund. But this thing has been struggling for quite some time. And yeah, some donors have, in a way, shied away, just to be diplomatic, and others have showed some interest, but then they disappeared afterwards. So we're still struggling with how do we fund these massive undertakings? It's a puzzle. Yeah, I just thought I should share some of what's going on. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. Jean, you want to come back on this?
Yeah. Briefly to come back to Francois' remark about the private sector. In the funds you have Gavi, and Gavi is funded partly by the private sector, like by Orange, Rockefeller, etc. So there may be an appetite for engaging more with the private sector. Then after what I take as from this discussion is that probably the advocacy initiative, the 4.3, should engage more on reaffirming the need in terms of funding for the humanitarian war sector, because I think there is a, like a sort of misunderstanding from the donors. There is a need. We need maybe to produce something to reaffirming it. And then I think discussing about the funding, I see two levels. One level is the funding for the humanitarian responses in the war sector. And one level, which is the small step, let's say, is funding the initiatives of the roadmap. So maybe we need also to have a sort of double language here, which donors are ready to support the roadmap, and then how can we take it to the global level. Thank you.
Thanks. Omar?
Yeah, I just wanted to share a thought, and I'll try to be as diplomatic as possible here. In a way, the fund, donor support to emergencies is driven by several agendas. For example, in Ukraine, and I'm gonna speak, and I'm sure this cuts across the board, everybody is overfunded. You ask for 10, you get 30. And this is the situation, and agencies are in a way struggling to know how to disperse the funding within the existing limitations. Of course, horizon is going to be the limit when the situation stabilizes, and then you start a new phase of recovery, reconstruction, etc. But as we speak now, agencies are struggling to spend the money. In contrast, in Pakistan, that just unfolded a few days or a week ago, after a very thorough mission by one of the major member states, you find a pledge of 30 million for everybody, not just for WASH. I mean, this is across the board. So, what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make here is the fund in a way defeats the purpose for many of the states that have their own drivers and reasons for supporting certain states. So if they make their contributions into that fund, they're no longer in control on how this is being dispersed, etc., etc. Unless, of course, it becomes like some of the existing models that are donor-driven, and then they decide which allocations are made where, which adds to the complexity and cumbersome, and in a way does defeat the purpose of what we are trying to achieve with this fund. Just a few thoughts that I thought I should share. Over.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, you have been trying to be diplomatic, but not so diplomatic. But anyways, any other comment? If not, I would like to come. Yeah.
Sorry, Jamal.
Guillaume.
Just a reaction to the first, to say that I fully agree with what Omar is saying. Eventually, donors like to control their money, and a fund is a mechanism where they would have less control over it. So that may play also a bit in their inputs in that. But I wanted to react on the last point regarding investors with interest in social impact. Just maybe to share a bit the experience that we have in ICRC, because we launched a few years back the first humanitarian impact bond that was not related to a WASH project, but to the construction and establishment of physical rehabilitation services for disabled people in conflict settings. And now we are getting to the end, and so we have quite a lot of lessons that we are learning from that. And I must admit that, it's complicated to work with social investors, and it requires time and energy. So if a fund would aim at engaging with social investors, it would probably be difficult to use this fund for emergency response, because they have quite a lot of criteria and expectations in regard to how we measure this impact, and you need to really bring evidence and all of that, and that would be quite difficult to achieve this in an emergency situation. Though it would be quite interesting to explore further, again, linking this fund to more resilience building, emergency preparedness, where it could be a bit more easy, and again would potentially free resources which are currently used for that, and that could be focused on emergency response. Voilà, just a reaction.
Thanks, Guillaume. Yeah, I want to come back on 2 points. One was on the existing funding and how we are going to convince donors or anybody that in the presence of existing funding like SURF, for example, which can be used for emergency response, and WASH is part of that, why we need an additional bucket of funding. So that's the first thing which we probably can discuss. I mean, how do we sell ourselves? That's my point. And secondly, linking with other sectors, this is the last point, which is on the slide, which is in front of us, about linking it with climate change funds and others. How is that possible, or if that is possible? Any reaction?
The reaction is I've got a reaction regarding the climate change, because when you look at funding the SDGs, it's already a competition between the climate funds, 100 billion a year for until 2030, and the SDG 6 funding. So I think that it's going to be very difficult to compete with that. What is not clear for me is that there are many emergencies that are either connected directly to climate change or to public health issues like the COVID, etc. So to define precisely what we mean by a WASH emergency, are we going to reinforce the health system? Are we going to make the communities more resilient? Are we going to build refugee camps? It's very different. So putting the boundaries, I think maybe at one point, if we build an advocacy material or something like this, we really need to clarify that, because emergencies everywhere, and you know, the wash sector is diluting itself in climate, in health, in nutrition, in many things. It's yeah.
I mean, what I understand from your point, John, is that it's not it's not considered as a standalone sector on its own in emergency response. It has to be in a supportive role to either public health emergency or something else. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it can be standalone. If you do water for refugees in a camp, you're going to be on standalone. But if you put your finger in climate resilience, climate adaptation, which are very connected to emergencies, or you know, then you're going to be to be challenged by other actors, development actors, etc. So, what do we need exactly? Where do we put ourselves?
Thanks, Omar.
Yeah, I think the entire initiative needs redesign and repitching and finding the selling points and identifying how would it be different from existing funds. Because otherwise, you know, just yet another fund similar to other funds that are already in place wouldn't make a difference. So I think we need to give it a new thought. Perhaps we need some external support in redefining what the proposed fund, what the purpose of the fund is, what is the difference, what is the selling point, what is the niche, strengths, and so forth. I think that is something worth taking a shot at. Thank you. Back to you, Jamal.
Thanks, Francois.
Yes, maybe just wanted to, not sure I understood what Guillaume said about the how we can explore and expand on the humanitarian impact bond mechanism. Are you recommending this should be explored further to get well, to channel some of the private sector funding, maybe outside of emergencies? I'm not sure I got the final recommendation there.
It's that. I believe exploring social investors for emergency wash response is highly unlikely to succeed.
So we should not explore, or we should?
If we purely target emergency response, we shouldn't. If we look at fund or any other mechanism that could support humanitarian wash, not specific to emergency response, it may be worth looking into it.
Okay, so we have here an opportunity to explore a mechanism to get private sector money, and that's supporting WASH activities which are not emergency related, which is kind of what the WASH sector roadmap is about, or not.
Yeah.
So when Omar says maybe we should redesign and reconsider the agenda of this initiative, maybe that's a direction we could follow. Like, how do we design, we expand on this humanitarian impact bond to get access to the CSR money that sits in the private sector to support non-emergency WASH activities.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
we can, yeah.
Okay.
Claudio?
Oh yeah, hi everybody. Hi, good afternoon. Hi. Yeah, no, I was trying to reflect a little bit on the partnerships with multinational and private sector and foundations, and now to reflecting a little bit on the experience that we have at Save the Children. I listed just a few, the ones that I'm aware of, with which Save the Children is dealing with, is in partnership and is getting financial fund and support. I was wondering if I don't know, a sort of a united fundraising strategy aimed at those at the rich, basically, and also proposing how to. It's about compromise. I mean, I'm not good at dealing with private foundation or with multinational like Unilever, because you always need to deal and to compromise, and you need to find like a common point, going down, reaching to a win-win situation in which you say, okay, well, we can look at the market, but our interest is in an emergency, in spending the money without looking only at improving and strengthening your market. So it's a negotiation that we all together could try to embark on. And yeah, I was wondering, because they are quite big money, I mean, but I wonder. I don't know if I elaborated well the point. In summary, is just why are we keen? It's a lot about principled humanitarian also approach. It's about negotiating with those who can provide the financial support and cleaning somehow the money and making the money. I mean, it's the mean that justify the ends, or the ends the means. This the whole debate, eternal debate. Do we want to join all together and reach out at those rich multinational organization, basically? That's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I wanted to bounce on Omar's point about Ukraine and Pakistan. I mean, the advantage of having a fund which is coordinated, a global fund, would be precisely to support the underfunded emergencies. So this is also narrowing a little the fund, and it may become more attractive to donors. You know, if we say we just want a global fund, I mean, they won't be interested. If we narrow it to funding underfunded emergencies, especially with support of local partners, that's much more attractive for a donor. It's more in their agenda. So I think at one point, Omar is right. We need to re-clarify exactly the niche that we want to fund. What do we want to fund? Knowing that the roadmap is not only humanitarian, but the need that was identified at the origin of the roadmap was a gap in the humanitarian WASH funding. So I think this exercise needs to be done. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a bit at the personal level. I mean, I think that it's challenging in the sense that WASH in eyes of the donors mostly, and by donors I mean the ones who make the decision, not the technical level people or the WASH people within the donors. In the eyes of those people, it's more like a supporting sector, not a standalone sector. For example, if there is a public health emergency, so yes, there is a WASH need, but it's not considered as something where you just involve yourself as WASH. So I mean, I think that it's quite challenging, and that's now our point of discussion in front of you. Following this consultancy, how can we imagine the future of Initiative 4.2? Let's concentrate on this question in front of you. What do you think? I mean, we presented the results of the consultancy. We had some preliminary discussion. So what's your view now? What do you think? Omar? You want to go?
Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, sorry, Omar, go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you, Jamal. I think, we need an expert, and I don't know what that discipline may be, perhaps an economist, a financial analyst, whatever, who's fully aware of the funding landscape, the various funds, not just in WASH, beyond WASH, to try to define the parameters, identify the real selling point from her or his experience, and design this way based on her or his knowledge of what can be a good selling point. I think this is what we need, a well thought, something that's done by an expert who can really get the business done properly, and then we move forward, because it doesn't help us, to keep on trying, something that we know it won't work. We need, to revive it. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Jamal.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that first, I think it was very useful to have this first step on the 4.2. I mean, clarifying the things and getting back the challenge of donors don't believing that there's any need, you know, that's pretty shocking, but it's useful to have it. After, what is important is to make the fund attractive to donors. First, I think that the fund should stay in the hands of the roadmap, maybe with the contribution of donors. So it means the fund would engage the donors with the roadmap. Secondly, I think we need to narrow it and maybe narrow it to like underfunded WASH emergencies. Then we need to find a sort of sexy process for the fund. Localization could be one of that, but we need to think about that. And then after we need to push the advocacy initiative on supporting this fund, because the advocacy initiative should find donors to engage on that. So for me, yes, Omar, I think we need to have a second step to that. For me, the second step is really someone, a consultant, or who will design the fund to make it really bankable to the donors community.
Thanks, John. Claudio, is it your old hand or it's a new hand? Okay. Emmett?
Yeah, new hand.
Yes.
No, I mean, it's an interesting discussion, but it seems like the participants and whoever else wants to join should reconvene to brainstorm a bit on next steps. But I was just reacting to Jean's last point, which, I mean, it sounds like the assumption in your idea there is that we need to go forward with a fund no matter what. But I'm not sure if that's the consensus in the group. I mean, I think we all agree on some of the problems. The most underlying problem is that we don't have the sufficient funds to provide good enough services in enough places. This, I think, we could all agree on. But then from there, I mean, it's not. It sounds like there's a good number of ideas to kind of follow up in these different spaces. Some challenges with some of them, as Claudio was outlining, with private sector engagement. But it's, yeah, I'm not sure that the consensus is we still need to plow ahead with a fund and we just need to improve it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it still needs a little bit of unpacking and a bit more thought. Yeah, I don't know, Joan, maybe you can just reply, because it sounded like you were still keen on the fund itself. Your impression is maybe it just needs to be pitched better, or?
Are you asking me, Emmett?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that initially when we set the roadmap with the group of directors, there were two evidences. One, that the humanitarian agencies should focus more on humanitarian WASH response, and B, that there was not enough funding for responding. So I think if we decide to stop this initiative, it's like, you know, turning our back to the initial commitment of the roadmap. So me, I would be in favor. I know it's difficult. It's a narrow road, and that's why we really need an expert. It's a narrow road, but I think if we forget about that, what are we going to do? I mean, you know.
Yeah. No, maybe I see Guillaume's hand up, and maybe he wants to react to what we've been saying. But I guess, yeah, I don't know. I still don't understand. You know, I still don't see. I agree. It's a narrow road. I don't know how we, you know, squeeze water from a stone at this point, and I don't think we give up. I think this is why the discussion maybe needs to come together with the advocacy initiative, is because advocacy is worth doing in its own right. I don't know. Maybe I was going to start opening up other topics. I hand over to Guillaume. Over.
I think there are donors. There are donors like the Nordic donors, like Denmark, for example, Norway, in another sense, Germany, who have a lot of money on the table, and who need to be approached on humanitarian WASH. Maybe we don't do that enough, or we don't do that in a sort of really, you know, strong way. And doing that with the support of UNICEF in a very strong way could be really a plus. I think we should try that.
Let's come back to that one, but before we go to Guillaume, maybe we can, Elisa, you wanted to say something?
Sorry, yeah, it's just because we conducted the French Water Partnership 2 years ago, like a very deep analysis of each bilateral donor and what their interest was in WASH. So we looked into their humanitarian strategy, their development strategy, their country by country plan. And it just, what appeared is that those bilateral donors all have different interests. So I'm a little bit worried about trying to put all the efforts into one WASH fund with one direction. There's just localization. And my question was more, do we have the capacity within the roadmap and the 36, is it 36 organizations, to diversify and really look at every donors, what their interest is, where they focus geographically, their funding, and try to distribute tasks. If one is really about climate change, then those guys, we put them in the same categories and we target them for climate change. If these are about gender, we try to see the link with gender, etc. So that was more a question of, do we want to put all our eggs in one basket, or do we want to use the force of 36 organizations to kind of identify maybe 2, 3, 4 angles? One organization goes towards multinational firms. A few organizations go to development actors, and we really diversify all kind of direction. And not only we look at the resilience, I think just looking at humanitarian WASH, and I think the conversation earlier were really good about, let's get all this resilience funded with more like development money, and that way that will liberate money for the humanitarian WASH response. That would be kind of my wondering if we could go that direction. Do we have the strength to do that?
Thanks.
The direction that we've been supporting for the last 10 years, what you're saying about resilience under the development funds, this is exactly the message that we push every time we can push it in advocacy. And Elisa, I think that the organization of the roadmap are already looking for donors. Here, I think what we are asking for is a more specific fund, a more specific mechanism, because even if all our organizations are looking for donors, there's still a gap on the WASH sector, humanitarian WASH sector, so it doesn't work so well. After we can decide, we can vote. I mean, I think we should push on that, but the roadmap has got a board, so if there is to be taken a strategic decision on this initiative, let's put it to the board and vote.
Okay, Liocha, before coming to you, Guillaume, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
Just a few reactions to what was said before. I think Elisa is right in the sense that I think we need to diversify the potential source of funding. Our traditional donors, their pot is empty. We'll not get more money from them. Or if we get more money from them, it would be to the detriment of other sectors. So we would not make friends, and we might pay the price over time. So I think it's our target should be new financing sources, those which we are not going to tap into so far, or maybe not good enough. And also in terms of, so we need probably indeed to have a diversified approach depending on where we will look into. If you tap into the development actors, it's not the same strategies than if you would to go towards social investors or to other potential sources of financing, and the same also in terms of financing mechanism. The fund is one way, but there are other ways to look into it. I mentioned the impact bonds, and there are plenty of others. I think that's what Omar was trying to aim at in saying that, yeah, we need economists. We need economists who are able to find ways of adapting to our needs with the way where the money is coming from. So I don't think that, yeah, what we had maybe in mind at the beginning, maybe one tool that would rule them all and where everybody would put money into and then we could just play with it, that I don't think that will work. We'll probably need to have a sort of toolbox of things where we could use in different settings, different situations to fund that. What I like, though, what you said, John, something that we really need to keep in mind is this focus on underfunding settings, on underfunding emergencies. And that's what these different tools should be used for. Because if we put things and then we got more money for Ukraine, we will have failed. So that's where in that kind of, this focus is super important.
Thanks, Guillaume. Alyosha?
Thanks, Jamal. No, I guess Guillaume said a lot of things on diversification, potentially tapping into other funds. So I think I would completely echo that. Just one approach on underfunded crisis, concretely speaking, where I spoke this morning to Central African Republic, looking at tracking the finances for the full cluster. And we are still struggling with the information that's provided by our system. And we see that in CAR, it's currently 4% funded, whereas with 2 months of work of cluster coordination and partners, we arrive at more of an 18% of funding with varieties of partners and streams of funding that the coordinator never knew before. So an example of one of these underfunded emergencies where gathering this information and having a financial kind of mapping, detailed mapping of what's going on is a struggle. And I'm not sure that we are equipped, and going back to Omar's points, as experts to move forward with that. So completely seconding the expertise needed from a humanitarian financing specialist or somebody who could take that into account and dig deeper into those mappings. So yeah, seconding a bit of what was said before, and also, adding on the complexity of mapping the data as Global Watch Cluster is still something we really struggle today with the financial tracking service. So over.
Thanks. Maybe last comment, Francois?
Yes. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay, maybe I missed a bit of the conversation here, but just wanted, it seems from my end that there is this requirement to get funding from emergency issues, WASH emergencies, and then this is like not what we can get from private sector, humanitarian private bonds, including mechanism. So if my understanding is correct, there's like at least 2 channels here. One is how do we get some funding to fund WASH in emergencies, and then the other one is how do we get maybe more private sector money to fund a non-emergency? So, and then bouncing on what Elisa says about having various initiatives, there might be room there to have like subcommittees that will address each of those potential channels and explore how it would work before shutting down the funding initiative and then linking this also to the advocacy. It might be that the advocacy work should be segmented as well in link with this funding strategy. So yeah, just seems that segmenting would be a good solution, as we all agree there, I guess.
Thanks,
Over.
Francois. Thanks. So then we have 4 minutes. So do you have? I don't know what was the expectation from this roundtable, but over to you.
Specific story goals from the roundtable. I think it's great that we've got a few participation on this topic. We actually had a few questions still to tackle, but as you said, we have 4 minutes left, so it might not be enough. We'll make sure to have those questions. You actually already have them. You got them in the email this morning. So I think there are questions that we can still think about, and we're of course very open to receive feedback and comments on them. If there's no further comment or remarks from the presentators, I think we can actually, yeah?
Hold on, there is a comment. It's what's next?
Yeah.
I mean, the what's next is that we need to put to SDC and to the supporters of the roadmap a strategy for pushing more this initiative 4.2 if the roadmap agrees on that. So at one point, maybe we need to have a sort of vote of the board or whatever, and then because the funding we are coming to the end of the year, so I think this element of what's next is super important to consider.
Absolutely. And I think the question of the vote may be at the steering committee, or we can discuss that later, could be relevant, because as you said, it's a strategic decision to be made. It's something that will influence the roadmap in itself, since it's one of its initiatives. It's definitely on the table.
Can I just to complete with that? So we're having an executive committee in 2 weeks. This is the first steps in terms of like, if you want to look for a proposal for next steps for 4.2, like revamping a little bit the initiatives, it looks like we want to continue the exploration. So the 4.2 should continue. If Jamal, Omar, Emmet, I don't know if you still want to take the leadership on this, because we don't want to add more work to you if you don't have the time for it. But maybe we can continue that conversation between the 4.2 colleagues, see what you're capable of doing in terms of next steps. If there is an emergency in terms of getting funding for a new consultancy, we can talk about that as well. But the deadline is pretty short. It's today or tomorrow, I think, for the next executive committee. But there will be another executive committee in October, so we can also have more time for that. But yeah, next steps, I think, is yes, we want 4.2 to continue, and maybe there could be also a task team that reflects on different avenues that we've investigated. So these are all things that you can maybe think of that other initiatives have been doing, and just to give you some ideas for the next steps.
Okay, thank you, Elisa, and thank you everyone for participating. Yeah, Jean?
Yeah, October seems a good time. I mean, it's too short in 2 weeks because we need really to present, to think what we are going to defend. But yeah, October would be a perfect timing from as far as I think.
Okay, we'll add it on the agenda for sure.
Thanks.
All right. Any further
Thanks a lot.
comments? Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to
Thank
Emmet,
you.
Jamal, and Omar. Have a great
Thanks.
afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.